So Joe Rogan has come out saying what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. You may have seen the clip. We'll play it for you. But now others are coming out saying, no, Joe Rogan, you are wrong. John Spencer from the Modern War Institute at West Point gives an entire diatribe of why what's happening in Gaza is not a genocide. He's been there twice since the war began. We're going to listen to him talking, to John Spencer talking on a podcast, trying to counter this narrative. I think it's important we hear from that perspective. Somebody that I would say is deeply entrenched in the military-industrial complex. He is the chair of the urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute of West Point. He's a career military expert. He is an urban warfare expert. He's written books on urban warfare, such as Understanding Urban Warfare. He also wrote, at the start of the Ukraine war, the mini manual for the urban defender. It's meant to help Ukrainians defend themselves in urban warfare against Russia. Not sure if he's going to write the same sort of manual for the Palestinians. That would be telling, wouldn't it? But let's go ahead and first watch this Joe Rogan clip, and then we're going to watch John Spencer try to give his expert opinion, his expert analysis as to why it's not a genocide. And then you decide if you agree with him, if you think John Spencer makes some good points. But here's Joe Rogan. He's talking to Kurt Metzger, who is often on the Jimmy Dore show. Here is this clip. Here it is.
Hey, I want to know what she was fired for. Because was it criticism of Israel? Did she show that Edward Snowden video that he put up on Twitter that shows them drone bombing those kids those men, I should say, unarmed people that were walking towards the rubble that clearly weren't causing any danger to anybody? Yeah, right. They just bombed them.
Yeah, no, it's your duty. It's just like for Biden or whoever you like, you're supposed to cover up for them.
But the whole thing is like they're always saying they're only targeting Hamas and everybody else is a casualty. Well, if those guys are just unarmed civilians and they're walking alone, that's what they appear to be.
Dresden.
And you just blast them from the sky with robots.
This is the tragedy of war.
Yeah, this is insane. And no one knows what to think now, because if you can't talk about that, if you can't say that's real, then you're saying that genocide is okay as long as we're doing it. And
that is what we're saying.
And if you're saying that from a perspective of someone who literally went through the Holocaust, or your people, your tribe, went through the fucking Holocaust, and now you're willing to do it?
I hope the irony's not lost on you.
It's so nuts. It's so hard to imagine that someone where a culture, like a country was like officially founded in, what, 47?
48.
48? Okay, officially founded. So that's so recent. and you guys are willing to do what was done to you that led you to believe that you needed to start your own country? You're willing to do that at least on a small scale in Gaza. Like, there's nothing left. If you see the videos, let's see some recent footage of Gaza.
Okay, so not everybody agrees with Joe Rogan. Here's John Spencer's tweet. He says, Joe Rogan, you are very wrong on Israel and how the war is going in Gaza. I just got back from Gaza. I'm one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare. Let's have a conversation about the facts, opinions, disinformation, myths about it, and the history of warfare. Okay, so we don't have John Spencer on the show today, and he hasn't talked to Joe Rogan yet, but we do have a podcast he was on. He was on a show with Times Radio, and he actually linked this under this tweet to Joe Rogan saying, here's my position, or this is what I'm seeing from an expert as to what's really going on in Gaza. So let's go ahead and listen to him. It's a bit long, so we're going to kind of go through it, pause, and then talk and keep going with it. But let's hear what an expert has to say. Why is what's happening in Gaza not actually a genocide?
Sure, and I've been twice. So I've been on the ground in Gaza, to include Khan Yunis, since the war has begun. So both from what I've observed in the field, watching the IDF, plus over a decade of studying this type of combat, the IDF nobody's acknowledged that the IDF are actually doing this with the least amount of civilian care in the history of war in the context of these type of operations. And listen to international condemnation since the beginning of the war and did it differently from the way they started the war. So how they operated in northern Gaza versus how they operated in central Gaza were vastly different. Some of that's based on the enemy, but they cut civilian casualties by a half and then by 2/3 to where now it's at an abnormally low for even combat in general.
Okay, but let's just pause there for just 1 second before the host jumps in here. But so he's basically admitting right there that the civilian casualties have been cut down, now to very little because they operated differently in the north than they are in the south. This isn't really a point for Israel. This isn't a point of, see, they're not really committing a genocide. They changed their tactics when the world started waking up and saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? You can't be dropping just dumb bombs on people. You say that you're targeting Hamas. You say you're targeting militants, that you're taking care for and making sure that civilians aren't killed, yet you're dropping 2,000-pound dumb bombs that have no targeting whatsoever. You're just dropping them on buildings. You know that there are women and children in those buildings, and you're doing it anyway. So the only reason why Israel actually made that shift, now John Spencer said, well, it was partly the enemy, but it really was because the world woke up and the world said, what are you doing? We're not going to allow you to continue dropping dumb bombs. You're obviously not doing what you claim you're doing, which is sophisticated pinpoint targeting of militants. That's not what was happening. So let's continue.
How did they change it? To explain that to you, how do you think they shifted that approach?
A lot of it was in the targeting process. So, the rockets were raining down, so they had to target rocket locations. The fight was a lot closer. They evacuated the cities versus doing very smaller operations. So they reduced the number of forces. They started with 4 divisions. Now they're down to 2 divisions. They also started.
They're down to 2 divisions because the divisions that they had there were getting ambushed. So they had, they're supposed to be like their special forces battalions that were being ambushed by Hamas militants. And then they would send in for reinforcements, and the reinforcements would be ambushed. And then the reinforcements would be ambushed. And these were supposedly areas where they had already cleared Hamas. So they were claiming victory. We already see we're doing a great job. And then suddenly they were being ambushed. So they ultimately retreated. So they're down to these 2 battalions that are there. But John is saying that, well, they're not clearing out as many people. They're not evacuating as many people, right? Because they already evacuated the entire north, moved everybody to a tiny area in the south. They then evacuated more areas of the south to another tiny area. So now you can't really, how many more times can you evacuate? Where do you evacuate them to? Where do you evacuate them from? So it's, again, not really looking at it now and saying, well, it's not a genocide anymore after you've already done all the damage is not really an argument. But let's keep going.
With handing out their maps and doing localized evacuations. So instead of the entire northern Gaza being evacuated, when they went into Khan Yunis, they were only evacuating like a 3 or 4 block area and tracking the civilian population and really telegraphing their locations even more than they were in northern Gaza, which
again, Khan Yunis is in southern Gaza. So they'd already evacuated northern Gaza. Now the people in southern Gaza are saying, well, they're not really doing full-on evacuations anymore. They were just doing targeted neighborhood evacuations.
Makes the battle go slower. It makes it go very block by block, house by house. They even did operations where they surprised 250,000 civilians in the middle of the night and then surrounded that area and then told them to evacuate and used facial recognition to pick up the Hamas miners who have been this whole time just moving when the civilians get evacuated. They just move with the civilians in the combat areas.
Some people will listen to this though and say, well, if we had to take the Hamas, I know it comes out of the Hamas health ministry, and although the Israelis at various times have said they kind of think these are more or less correct figures, when you talk to the IDF, they never say there's a different set of figures that they're operating on. So if we take those figures, 31,000, 32,000 dead, people often contrast that with the fact that there was 1,000 dead in the the terrorist atrocity back in October the 7th. And they say 31,000 dead, many of whom are civilians, many of whom are children, is fundamentally unacceptable. It's an unacceptable figure to go after Hamas.
Yeah, I think that's really problematic. I agree that, 30,000 civilians have not died in Gaza. That's a fact, because that number doesn't account for a single Hamas member. But yeah, if people think that any death of any human is a bad thing, and civilian casualties that always happen in war, every one of them is a travesty, and I agree. And even in my battles, when you do everything physically possible in urban combat, there are some civilian casualties who, despite all the penetration. So the idea that it's too much, though, and I got this from the beginning of the war, right? So I study wars in general. So that's like saying, Pearl Harbor, 4,000 Americans dead, You can only kill 4,000 Japanese or 4,000 Germans. Um, this quantitative number, that there is a number that says, I don't care that it's a threat to your existence. I don't care if they're launching rockets at you. I don't care if they're holding 200 of your civilians, babies, elderly. It doesn't matter. The number is too much. That's not the way war works.
Okay, the Geneva Conventions. In fact, citing World War II, we learned a lot of lessons after World War II, and we actually created rules of war after World War II to prevent going as hardcore as people did in that war. That is not looked at as a beacon for how to behave and how war should be.
Never has, never will be. There are requirements to make a judgment and to use only the force necessary to achieve the military goal, and what the value of that goal is, both in the war and in the actual strike or operation, and then compare that to the collateral damage, and have you done everything possible to reduce the collateral damage. So somebody who says 30,000 civilians, 30,000 people dead is too much for even though it's an existential threat to Israel. So that means that they want a much more violent world. Because if we lead in a world where you can do what Hamas did, which is create an environment where you can't get to them unless you do a lot of destruction. And then somebody will say, well, you just shouldn't do the war. And that's just not the history of humankind. And unfortunately, one is because it's Israel, but also because people believe there should be bloodless wars. I don't have a problem with a pacifist, somebody who actually believes there should be no killing in wars. And actually, in my field of work, I've had to deal with those people because 90% of the casualties of modern wars have been civilians. 90% of them. I understand those guys. They don't want any war. They want no killing. They want you just not to fight. But there has come a time in history when nations have to defend. It's the sole interest of any nation or individual is survival.
I understand that point, and you are taking it very, very, very clearly. I guess some criticism has been that the military aim itself comes into question. Can you bomb Hamas out of existence in the way that Netanyahu says? Can you take something that's both an idea and an embedded terrorist group and something that has some tentacles into civilian life, and if you come at it from the top and you crush buildings, 60% of Gaza turned to rubble, that may seem that that's not going to achieve the aim, and therefore it is an inappropriate method of war because it actually won't kill an idea. It won't kill the Hamas leadership who aren't even in Gaza, many of them. It is going to it's going to hit an awful lot of people who aren't Hamas and not achieve the aim, and therefore it seems disproportionate.
Yeah. No, I've heard the argument. It's riddled with an unawareness of how war works, ignorance to war. It mixes multiple forms of war. One is in military theorists from ancient times that said the first step is to recognize the type of war you're in. So by every definition, the IDF have achieved the goals of destroying Hamas military capability. Hamas was a governing authority, a power. It wasn't an insurgency. It wasn't a terrorist group, although they are terrorists. It was a governing authority of a territory, a de facto state, with a military of 30,000 plus individuals in light infantry battalions, in 400 miles of tunnels, with 15,000 rockets, 12,000 of those they shot already at Israel. By every metric of a military, so that's saying, well, I agree with you. Bombing does not destroy an enemy. You have to launch a combined joint ground, air, sea invasion and destroy the enemy or force them to surrender. That is war. That is literally the definition of war. It is, attacking the enemy's will to fight. You either take his political seat of power, destroy his military, take his territory until they basically say, we're not going to fight anymore. By every metric, the way this war has been engaged has destroyed Hamas. It has destroyed their military capability. It has returned half of the hostages, and it has prevented Hamas from attacking Israel because they started with 4,000 rockets a day and now they get down to 0 or 1 or 2 by every metric. Now, this idea that you can't kill an ideal, right? So that's mixing in counterinsurgency theory into war, right? Because the day after does matter. I 100% agree with that. But this idea that you're creating more enemy, you can't kill an ideal, this won't achieve your goal. 100% of the 3 goals of this war, the IDF are achieving it, and they're close to ending the war to bring hostages home, destroy Hamas's military capability. Yes, you'll have to do. Once you enter into post-conflict operations, there's a lot you have to do to prevent Hamas from resurging. That's separate than the war. And then secure Israel's borders, stop the rockets, and create the buffer so October 7th can't happen again. By every metric, they're doing it.
No. And they should have, that's exactly what they should have done, was focus on their defense, their idea of defense. And one of the problems with modern warfare, by the way, this is the world's leading expert in urban warfare that we're listening to. So this is the brightest of the brightest minds of who is defending Israel's behavior against the Palestinian people in Gaza. This is the brightest of the minds, okay? So he's saying that by every metric, they have actually achieved their aims, which is they have returned half the hostages. That was not done. That was not done through warfare. The hostage release has been done through a prison exchange deal. That's how those hostages came back. Others were bodies were repatriated through military operations, so they were able to get dead hostages back to Israel. They said 11 bodies of hostages were repatriated to Israel, with 3 of the hostages killed by friendly fire from the IDF. So that is, and then they said 8 bodies of hostages repatriated through military operations. 33 hostages were reportedly killed in Hamas captivity, according to Israel. According to unconfirmed Israeli intelligence, at least 20 additional hostages may be deceased, with their bodies being held captive in Gaza. As of 14th of February, 134 hostages remain in captivity in the Gaza Strip, 130 of whom were abducted on October 7th, the other 4 hostages having been captured earlier. So they have not been able to achieve their goals of returning the hostages through military means. The only way they were able to really get them back alive was through a ceasefire and a hostage exchange deal. That's what worked, not the military operation. This host is correct that the leadership of Hamas isn't even in Gaza. So you eradicate all of these people. You haven't even gotten to the leadership. And he says, well, but they were able to get rid of all their weapons because they bombed the crap out of them. And so there are no more weapons. Well, it's not like you have a finite stockpile of weapons. I mean, weapons can come back in. And that's Israel's argument, right? They say, well, we have to eradicate all of them because they're going to get more weapons. Well, why would these people want to get more weapons against you? What lessons have you taught them that make them think you're the good guys that are there to liberate them? Are you going to give them a better life? And so they should therefore stop fighting you? I mean, the bottom line is what you're fighting against is a group of oppressed people rising up, and they're not going to stop rising up until the oppression stops. That is what the war is really, truly about. It's about an oppressed group of people who no longer want to be oppressed. And of course, they're going to fight tooth and nail until they're no longer oppressed. Even when this war is over, if they're still oppressed, they will rise again. And this time, they're going to have a lot more sympathy from the rest of the world, because the world is looking at this and saying, Israel's oppressing this group of people. They've risen up. They can't continue to oppress them anymore. We have to stop. And then look at what they do when these oppressed people rise up. The oppressed people at this point, moving forward, will have every ounce of sympathy from the world. If these Palestinian people didn't hate Israel before, which they had every right to, I'd give you a pass completely if you're Palestinian and you absolutely hate Israel. I think that's completely understandable with what they've been through decade after decade. But now the rest of the world is starting to hate Israel too. It's not just the Palestinian people. And that's not because of woke brainwashing. That's from looking at what's happened on the ground. You think Joe Rogan is a victim of woke brainwashing? That's from looking at what's going on the ground and saying, you have not taken care or concern for civilians. You are not trying to liberate this group of people from the oppression of Hamas and help them then rebuild their lives so that they can live peacefully amongst you. That is not what is happening here. They're trying to punish these people for rising up while being oppressed. That's what this is. It's don't you dare do this again or we will massacre you. And Israel doesn't have a plan for the day after. They don't have we're going to liberate these people. We're going to rebuild a new government. We're going to rebuild their land like we did for Germany, like we did for Japan. They're not planning to do that. They have not released any plans for that. In fact, when any other country in the world says, hey, this is what we want you to do, they reject it. They just completely reject it. So I wanted to play this for you because this is the world's leading expert on urban warfare, somebody who's been to Gaza twice since this has happened, somebody who is with our military industrial complex, who's with West Point, the Modern Warfare Institute of West Point. And this is the argument they make. And in my opinion, it's extremely flimsy. It's not good enough to say, well, they stopped bombing the north. They changed their tactics. So how could you possibly say they're not taking care and consideration? So for the first couple of months, they just massacred a bunch of people. The world woke up to it, criticized them, and they said, ooh, okay, we can't really get away with that exactly the way we were doing before. We're going to have to do it some other way. After they already did the bulk of the damage, Gaza City was the most populated area of Gaza, and that was in the north, and that has been decimated. So they stopped after they went after what is essentially the New York City of Gaza. And they said, okay, well, now that we've pretty much damaged the most populated place and where all of your infrastructure was, we can slow it down. That does not mean that they suddenly have taken care and compassion for these people. So, look, people are waking up. Joe Rogan, I think, he's definitely listened to a lot of people in the past on his show. This was like the reason why this was news was because this was his first time of saying this is a genocide, when before he'd kind of listen and ask questions that seemed to be like he was inching towards that position, but now he's flat out said it. And the world's foremost expert on modern warfare just gave you his arguments as to why you're wrong. It's not a genocide.